The Executive Leadership Series. This week, we're going to be discussing how best to organize teams for crisis management. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, the purpose of these discussions is to provide an online venue for executives to have a way to discuss the most pressing topics that they're dealing with today and gather insight and share that insight with each other. So we're going to have a brief presentation led by Dr. Hinderleiter, and at the end of that, we're going to have an open discussion where we can gather your thoughts and feedback and insight from everybody on the call. And during the presentation, if you have some thoughts, be sure and send that in using the chat feature that we have there within Zoom. Again, my name is Mark Johnson. I'm an executive technology advisor. And my co-host for these discussions is Dr. Hinderleiter. And Dr. Hinderleiter has been advising CEOs and executives for many years. And one of the things I really respect is not only his deep knowledge, but his hands-on experience. He's led billion-dollar global companies and dealt with these issues for many, many years and has some great perspective and insight on these type of topics. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you and let you walk us through this discussion today.
Thank you, Mark. So today's conversation is, organizing teams for the purpose of crisis management. And, as I think back over about the last 12 years, this is kind of our third major crisis, at least where we live in kind of South Texas. For everybody else, it's at least the second one. We had kind of the big recession of 2008, and that was a pretty good crisis for businesses and people. In South Texas in 2017, we had Hurricane Harvey and the major flooding as an aftermath of that. It was very disruptive to businesses here in South Texas. But other parts of the country experienced kind of natural disasters too that are disruptive. And then here we are again, a global crisis. And so what I want to share today is what I see some of my clients doing really well. And I'm actually participating with them in doing some of these things. And so today I'm going to share ideas for four different distinct teams, in-house teams, cross-functional teams to help guide organizations through this current, literally global crisis. So team one, I suspect most companies have some version of this. It's the crisis management team. And what they do generally, it's a little different for different companies, but what I see my client companies doing with their crisis management teams is they identify all the risks in the business. And, it's really important that these are cross-functional teams and that they're wide across all the functions, but they're also deep down into the organization, not just senior executives, but people who are on the ground who really know the business intimately. So, it's sales and operations and IT and HR and safety if you have that function in your business. And so it's really a wide and deep team. And their job is just to identify every real, existing, and potential risk to the business that's created by this current crisis or any other crisis that may come your way. So that's their first job, is really to get on a whiteboard and identify all the risks and the magnitude of those risks. And then really to develop a game plan to mitigate those risks. And sometimes you have to prioritize those. You may have, 15 risks, but the first 3 or 4, could be, really more dramatic, really more disruptive to the enterprise. So sometimes there has to be a prioritization of the plan to mitigate those risks. And then, it's on paper now, but we have to execute that game plan. And so the companies that I'm working with are doing a good job of this. What one of my clients has asked me to do is, in a couple of months, come back and, get their leadership teams together and do a postmortem about their crisis management effort so that we can really identify lessons learned, what the company really did well to identify and mitigate risks and what we can do better next time, because there will be a next time. We just don't know when it is or what it is, but we have to be prepared for that next time. So that's the first team, is that crisis management team, and they're dealing with the here and now. The second team that I see in place for some of my client companies, and I am participating as one of the team members for one of my client companies, is a communications team. And what these teams are doing, again, they're cross-functional. They are developing a communication strategy specific to this crisis. And the strategy includes communicating to the workforce, to the organization, communicating to their customers about, how they're handling this and how they're going to continue to meet the needs of their customers. And talking frankly about any disruption in meeting the needs of the customer. So really have to think about our customers as well as our organization. And then suppliers and vendors too. One of the things I've seen, Mark, is some companies' products are disrupted because their supply chain is disrupted. They get products from China or other countries, and that supply chain is disrupted. So it's really important to communicate with our suppliers and vendors too. And so really, we got to develop a really good communication strategy. Go back to number 2, if you would. And, some of the things we have to do in our communication strategy is absolutely inform and reassure people that the world is not ending, that we've got a plan in place and we're going to keep working that plan. And then enlist the support of your employees, of your customers, of your suppliers, so that you're not carrying the whole burden, that you're coming up with solutions that include everybody who's impacted. And then execute the plan. And then once this crisis is over, evolve that communication plan beyond the current crisis. Conversation I was in the other day with a client where I'm a member of their communication team is, one of the things that we put into place was a weekly town hall, a Zoom town hall with every employee in the company. And it's really, really been effective. Great feedback. The company president talks about what's happening at the high level, the enterprise, and then kind of department heads, IT and HR and finance and sales and operations. They talk about kind of what's happening there. So people are just informed and reassured. But the conversation we were having was, before the crisis, we didn't have a town hall. And once the crisis is over, we ought to keep it. And maybe not do it every week, but it's been such a big hit. The feedback has been so good that we should evolve this beyond their current crisis and maybe have a quarterly town hall. So some of these things could continue and evolve to meet kind of the needs of, post-crisis. So that's what the communication teams are doing from my perspective, and adding a lot of value. The third team is the recovery team. Again, I see a lot of companies that have this, and the essence of that recovery team is, what's our game plan? Once this thing is over, or at least largely over, where, the governors are kind of given the all clear, we can open up the economy and companies can go back to work and those kind of things. So we got to have a game plan for that, that includes thinking about our employees, includes thinking about our customers, includes thinking about our vendors and suppliers. All the things that we identified on team 1 is, what are we going to do to get back to, and here's the key, we got to develop a plan for the new normal, not the old normal, because the old normal is probably gone. So we really have to think about what we believe the new normal will be. And we won't get it all right, because none of us, have crystal balls, but we have to put smart people in a room and think about what this new normal is going to look like, and create a game plan that has the employees and the customers and the suppliers and vendors in mind. And then we have to communicate that game plan so that people know what to do when it's time to kind of get back to work. We got to execute that plan. And then, kind of like what I said with one of the other teams, the crisis management team, I think it's going to be really important to revisit the plan for the new normal, maybe 90 days out or 180 days out, because we're going to make some educated guesses about what the new normal looks like. And 90 days later, we'll realize we weren't 100% right, because we're just not going to be. And 180 days later, we're going to realize some things are different than we anticipated. So the point there is we really have to go back at some intervals. I just said 90 and 180 days. And it could be, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months kind of a thing too, so that we go back and make necessary adjustments so that we are not only recovering, but getting back to thriving. And Mark Johnson and I were talking about this earlier. Boy, this could be a tremendous difference maker, because if my company, your company, out recovers, probably not a word, but does a better job of recovery from this thing than our competitors, we got a really big advantage. So to the extent that we got a smart game plan for this new normal, we communicate it, we execute it, and we fine tune it over the next year or so, we stand a really good chance of not only recovering, but even possibly coming out even stronger. And the fourth team is, and maybe not every company is thinking about this. One of my clients is doing this, and I'm participating on this team too with one of my clients. I'm just generally calling it the opportunities team. And this is pretty different than that crisis management team. The crisis management team is dealing with tactical stuff, the here and the now. They're mitigating existing risks. They're identifying and mitigating risks that exist right now. The opportunities team is a different group from my perspective, and with my client companies that are doing this. This is a group of people that are kind of out of the box thinkers, have a kind of a broad worldview of the industry and the marketplace. And so here's their job, is to really identify potential opportunities that could come from this current crisis. They're thinking outside the box. And so one of my companies, when I kind of worked with them, just to kind of start the thinking process, we identified just some categories of opportunities to be thinking about. Well, this isn't exhaustive. It was just kind of a way to tee up the thinking process. So is some opportunistic acquisitions something that should be looked at? Because some companies, their value may be down, and yet they could bring some strategic value. So opportunistic acquisitions could be one of those things. Every company can look at process improvements, because the way that work is getting done is different now that we're working remotely. So it's really an opportunity, as we come back to the workplace, of creating some process improvements. And I think one of the things that I already see is companies are communicating better. So that's a process that I see companies already improving. But there could be any number of opportunities to create process improvements and better efficiencies and those kind of things. Are there new revenue sources that could be available to us in this new normal? I don't remember if I talked about it in one of the early calls, Mark, but one of my clients is in the promotional products business, like promotional jackets and hats and t-shirts and safety helmets and, some of those kind of things. And they're event related, company events and client events and those kinds of things. And those kind of dried up because we don't have events right now. And so they were really kind of scrambling, new ways for revenue sources and fulfill customer needs. And so what this company did was realize that, what we really do well was we manage supply chains. They don't create any of those, or they don't produce any of those promotional products. What they do is do a really good job of managing a supply chain. So they acquire these promotional products from this list of vendors, and they make them available to their consumers. So they manage a supply chain. So they kind of ask themselves, how can we manage our supply chain with a different set of products to a different set of customers? And they got in the PPE business. And so they reached out to their supply chains and found some suppliers of masks and gowns and gloves and actually even testing I don't know if it's equipment, but testing materials. And so they already have acquired a couple of new pretty good sized customers to provide some of those kind of materials, traditional business as well as healthcare. So just thinking outside the box and thinking about what we do well and what's a different application of what we do well was kind of a pretty smart, innovative way to create new revenue sources by finding new ways to fulfill customers' needs. So I thought that was pretty slick. And then, once we kind of got a whole bunch of ideas that we're considering for opportunities, we can't do all of them. Hopefully, in the brainstorming and whiteboarding process, we come up with a very long list of opportunities. And then it's the job of kind of senior leadership to prioritize, which ones really could bring value to our customers, which ones are the ones that we can execute based on our own unique competencies in our organization, and pick one of those or two of those or however many of those that make sense. So that opportunities team, I suspect, is not very common to what companies are doing now. My experience is a lot of companies are just kind of dealing with the here and now and how are we going to recover. But this is a pretty unique approach to really thinking outside the box to create new revenue streams and new ways to provide value to our customers. So those are 4 teams that I highly recommend. You don't want all the same people on these 4 teams because you overburden, key people. My thought is, my experience is, the people from team 1, the crisis management team, and people on team 4 should be very different people. One's tactical and one's pretty strategic. And go wide and go deep into the organization because you want the best thinking kind of regardless of their title. So anyway, that's what I see happening with my client companies that I am really impressed by. And the ones that are doing at least 3 of these, I've got one client that's doing all 4 of these. They are I am absolutely convinced they are going to recover more quickly, and they are going to kind of seize opportunities that just other companies, maybe their competitors, wouldn't have thought of. So anyway, I recommend 4 teams to really help not only navigate and survive this crisis, but thrive after it. So that's what I got, Mark. Back to you.
Great thoughts, Mark. Really appreciate that insight. I from all the companies I work with, when you talk with their executive team, they all feel like they have a plan. One of the big differences, though, is the details of those plans.
Yeah.
So, the old adage, the devil's in the details. What happens is when you only have 2 or 3 people building the plan, so it's just your top executives building the plan, a lot of times you miss some of the details that may be going on the front line. So by breaking down these teams in the way that you described, you're going to really tap a different level of detail and insight that you'd get versus just doing it all at an executive level, for example. So I think it's going to be very valuable if you can dig into these teams in the way you outline.
I don't watch Dr. Phil, but I've heard people kind of quote him. Apparently, he says, real world a lot. What's real world? Well, when we get frontline people and middle managers participating on these teams, with executives, it is more real world. They are familiar with what happens at the ground level with customers and suppliers and people. So absolutely, uh, you know, these teams should be wide, they should be deep, to your point.
An example I saw recently is that one of the groups of companies that are really struggling during this crisis are restaurants. So they've been shut down, and a lot of them can't bring any revenue, although they have a curbside, a lot of cases. But the curbside's been kind of hit and miss. Some of them have done okay, and some of them have had zero business from curbside. So one of the creative approaches I saw is that a local restaurant partnered with the local HEB, which HEB is a big grocery store chain here in Texas. And they are now packaging their food they sell in the restaurant and putting it in the HEB in the front section because as a convenience item. And when they interviewed them, they said, it was one of our frontline employees that was sitting there making the food and say, we're not seeing many people call to do curbside, but everybody goes to the grocery store and will buy the ready-made food. And so they started packaging their food and putting it in their local grocery stores, and it's doing banner business now. So it's an example of how tapping into people on the front line that may think a little bit different can give you some of your best ideas and can be the idea that may really save your company during these times. So I really like the idea of having an opportunities team that thinks outside the box like that.
Yeah, you remind me of, this is probably a 20-year-old kind of example, but Enterprise Rent-A-Car, headquartered in my hometown of St. Louis. And I think now they're the largest privately held company in North America. And one of their differentiators they created about 20 years ago was, we'll pick you up, right? And they got away from the airports and into kind of the neighborhoods, working with, companies that fixed cars, repaired cars, collision repair. And so we'll pick you up did not come from an executive. It came from one of the employees that worked at a local branch. And that became really one of the differentiators for Enterprise for a long time. It not only was a slogan that they used to brand themselves with, it was just a very practical differentiator of picking people up. And so again, just another example of reach down inside the organization where people live in the real world and interact with customers.
Right.
One of the things that just to pick on one of the things you said is that I've read is some restaurants are providing meals for first responders, and at cost, right? So the cool thing, there are just many cool things about that. It allows the restaurant just to keep afloat and keep people working, right? And it provides a community service that's just invaluable. So again, that's thinking outside the box, trying to serve the customer, serve the community, provide value in kind of unique and different ways. So, put creative people in that task force and get the front line in that opportunities group, and some cool things will come about. And we see some of that happening already.
Right. When we look back in history, often in the news you hear people talk about the 2008 crisis as kind of a milestone in time, kind of a time that things changed in the way the world worked going forward. And I'm sure that this will be a milestone in time as well. The post-COVID-19 crisis will be a milestone. And the milestone will be, how did companies adjust? How did companies change coming out of this milestone? So that's why this planning process is so critical. And the better companies do at the planning process you just described, I think the stronger they'll be coming out of this. It is truly a relaunching point in time, I believe, for most companies.
It is. You know, I don't know. It's been maybe the last 10 years or so where I've been saying this a lot. Not just me. A lot of people are saying, you know, one of the key competencies now for companies is agility.
Hmm.
You know, the ability to kind of pivot and change and evolve and adapt, largely driven by technology. Mark, you're the tech guy, way more than me. So technology has created new businesses. It's created new competitors. It's created new services. It's given some companies great opportunities, and it's created tremendous disruption, you know, to other companies. So while we've been saying this for a while, companies really have to learn to adapt. It's kind of that old change or die thing. Well, that's truth is on steroids right now. It's never been more true, certainly in our lifetimes anyway, that just having the ability to deal with the crisis of the day and yet map out what's next. And so that's really kind of the point of these four teams, is to do exactly that, is to deal with the crises of the day, communicate and enlist the organization and the customers and the suppliers, and at the same time have a group working on creating the new normal, you know, the future.
Right. Mark, Rod has a great point. We unmute Rod, and I think he has a point in the chat that he wrote in. Rod, maybe you can talk us through. I think it's a great point you made in the chat session.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time over the last 4 or 5 years talking about the rate of change and the doubling of available knowable information in the world and how that affects things. And then all of a sudden it's in our face during this COVID thing. And change is, I think, no longer going to be planning from milestone to milestone. You complete this change, you pick up the next change, you go to the next change. I think it's going to be more daily, and that we've got to be agile and we've got to be more flexible in our visions and how we change our vision from maybe even month to month as this knowable information influences what we do daily.
Well, that's a great thought.
That is.
I don't know about you all, but I think people, in my experience over the last few years, got tired of hearing about got to change, got to change, got to change, got to adapt. You know, I just kind of saw people's eyes glaze over when I'd be in meetings. Yeah, I get it. And now it's thrust on us. It's, I think what Rod said, it's in our face. So we can't just kind of say, yeah, anymore, because that is the new normal: daily change, weekly change, monthly change. The crisis of today may not be the crisis of tomorrow. And I mean, literally tomorrow, just as kind of Rod's talking about. So that's definitely new leadership competencies, new organizational competencies, and we may have to structure our organizations differently and have people in our organizations that are absolutely devoted to, you know, dealing with the crisis of the day, as well as devoted to kind of looking at the future. So these four teams that I'm talking about may need to be kind of standing teams, you know, going forward. And again, they'll evolve too. You know, those are the four teams that I see working right now, and they may evolve to something completely different, but it's not going away.
It's a great point. You know, so
yeah, thank you, Rod. Great perspective.
Yeah, traditionally, you know, companies did an annual plan, and they may have like quarterly reviews, but that was kind of the cycle they had. But to Rod's point, that may be more of a daily discussion or a daily review. And then that brings up a lot of other questions, which is, if that's the case, how do you communicate that throughout the organization? So when you do pivot, how do you make sure everybody understands that there's a pivot taking place, especially if you don't all sit in one office? How do you keep everybody in sync? How do you gather that timely information from all the different parts of the organization, gather it up, make the pivot, and then communicate it back out in a timely manner? So companies will have to think that through.
I think that's why these teams are so important, Mark. I mean, my experience, and maybe yours is different, is it's the same people, in senior leadership that are responsible for strategy and execution and communicating and kind of looking to the future and managing the crises of the day. And they just get overburdened with it, overwhelmed with it. And I mean, we all know that when we try to kind of juggle too many balls, we drop all of them, not just one of them, we drop all of them. And so that's why I think we have to really think about that differently and start chunking up some of those responsibilities, pardon me, with some of these teams that are really dedicated to these activities. So to your example, Mark, is when we are pivoting and creating new plans, how do we communicate that? Well, let that communication team figure that out and execute that. That way, you don't have the same group of 6 or 8 people trying to plan and execute all of those things, because it's just too much.
Great. Anybody else on the call like to provide some insight or have any questions? If not, we'll wrap it up. And if anybody would like a copy of this material to share with your teams, feel free to reach out to Mark or I. Or if you'd like a deeper dive, Mark or I would welcome the opportunity to talk with you and your team and take a deeper dive on this topic. Thank you for your time today and have a great week.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks everybody for tuning in.